November 8, 1944, Route Nationale 4, somewhere between Verdun and Metz. The engine of the lead GMC Deuce and a Half coughed, sputtered, then died. Private First Class Eugene Hartwell watched his fuel gauge drop to empty as the convoy behind him ground to a halt in the freezing rain. 43 trucks, 200 soldiers, 0 gasoline. The front lines were 18 miles ahead, tanks waiting, ammunition running low. And in that moment, staring at that needle touching E, Hartwell realized something the generals in their headquarters had missed. The war wasn't being lost on the battlefield. It was being lost one wasted gallon at a time. Before we go further, I just want to take a moment to thank you all for being here. Whether you're watching from Texas, Toronto, Tokyo, or anywhere in between, it amazes me that we can all gather around these stories from 8 decades ago. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. And if this story moves you, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now back to November 1944, and a problem that was quietly strangling the Allied advance. The Allies had broken out of Normandy 4 months earlier. Patton's Third Army was racing across France so fast that German commanders couldn't believe the speed. American Sherman tanks were covering 30, sometimes 40 miles a day. Infantry divisions were advancing faster than anyone had planned. On paper, victory looked inevitable, but paper doesn't run on gasoline. And gasoline was the one thing the Allies were running out of faster than bullets. By September 1944, the pursuit had outrun its own supply lines. The ports of Normandy were still handling cargo, but the front had moved 300 miles east. Every gallon of fuel had to be trucked from the beaches to the advancing armies. And every truck burned fuel just to deliver fuel. The numbers were staggering. A single Sherman tank burned through 168 gallons of 80-octane gasoline to travel about 120 miles. That's roughly 1.4 miles per gallon. Each tank, every day, hungry and inefficient. Multiply that by thousands of armored vehicles. Then add the trucks. The standard GMC Deuce and a Half, the workhorse of American logistics, managed between 4 and 8 miles per gallon depending on load and terrain. On September 1, 1944, Patton's Third Army literally ran out of fuel outside the Moselle River. Not because the Germans had destroyed supply dumps, not because of enemy action, simply because the logistics couldn't keep pace. Tanks that could have rolled into Germany sat silent in French fields, their crews staring at empty fuel gauges while the enemy regrouped. The Red Ball Express was the Allied answer to this crisis. Created in August 1944, it was a non-stop truck convoy system that operated 24 hours a day. Over 6,000 trucks, driven mostly by African-American soldiers, moved along 2 dedicated highways from supply depots to forward positions. They were ordered to maintain 60-yard intervals and a maximum speed of 25 miles per hour. Safety regulations, convoy doctrine, standard procedure. But here's what nobody had calculated. Those trucks were burning an estimated 300,000 gallons of gasoline per day just to stay moving. To deliver fuel, they consumed fuel. The system worked, barely, but it was bleeding resources. Maintenance crews reported that vehicles were wearing out faster than expected. Drivers arrived exhausted, unable to focus. Breakdowns increased. And fuel efficiency? Nobody was even measuring it properly. Then, in late September, something unexpected happened. A convoy returning from a resupply run near Charleville reported unusual numbers. They'd used 14% less fuel than identical convoys over the same route. The quartermaster who received the report assumed it was a clerical error. But when he checked the math, the numbers held. Every truck in that convoy had arrived with more fuel in reserve than predicted. The report made its way up the logistics chain, flagged with a single word: anomaly. What the report didn't mention was that the convoy had been led by a driver named Corporal James DeWitt, a former long-haul trucker from Missouri who'd spent 10 years driving freight across the Great Plains before the war. DeWitt had learned something during those years that the Army training manuals never taught. Fuel isn't just consumed by distance, it's consumed by rhythm, or rather, the lack of it. Every time a driver accelerated hard, fuel burned. Every time he braked suddenly, momentum was wasted. Every gear change at the wrong moment, every idle minute with the engine running, every climb taken too aggressively, It all added up. During civilian runs, DeWitt had developed his own method. He called it smooth rolling. Accelerate gently. Hold a steady speed. Coast into turns. Use terrain to your advantage. Don't fight the road. Let the engine breathe. On a 1,000-mile haul, his method could save 50 gallons. Multiply that by a convoy of 40 trucks and you were looking at real numbers. When DeWitt took command of a convoy in September, he briefed his drivers with a simple message. Pretend you're hauling eggs and your wallet's on the fuel gauge. They laughed, but he made them practice. He had them space themselves exactly 50 feet apart to reduce wind resistance, a principle called drafting. He told them to downshift early on hills and let gravity do the work on descents. No engine revving. No racing to catch up after a stop. Just smooth, steady, relentless forward movement. The drivers grumbled. Some ignored him at first. But by the time they reached their destination, even the skeptics had noticed something. Their trucks felt less strained. Engines ran cooler. And the fuel gauges read higher than expected. That 14% savings caught the attention of a logistics officer in Verdun, Major Robert Klein. Klein had been fighting the fuel crisis since August with requisition forms and priority lists. Now he was looking at raw data that suggested a solution nobody had considered. What if the problem wasn't supply? What if it was waste? Klein ordered another test convoy, this time with strict monitoring. Every truck was topped off at the start. Fuel usage was logged at 3 checkpoints. Drivers received written instructions based on DeWitt's methods. Maintain formation, no unnecessary idling, gentle acceleration, predictable braking, use the terrain. The convoy departed on October 12th, heading northeast toward Nancy. What happened over the next 48 hours would quietly change Allied logistics for the rest of the war. The test convoy covered 220 miles through variable terrain. Rain, mud, damaged roads, conditions identical to what every other convoy faced. But when they arrived and the fuel logs were tallied, the results were undeniable. 18% reduction in fuel consumption compared to standard operations. 18%. Klein read the numbers 3 times. Then he did the math. If every convoy in the European theater adopted these methods, the Allies could save over 400,000 gallons of fuel per week. That was enough to keep an entire armored division moving for 3 extra days. Enough to turn a stalled offensive into a breakthrough. But convincing the higher command was another matter. When Klein submitted his findings in late October, the initial response was skepticism. One colonel wrote in the margin, "We're not fighting a fuel economy competition, we're fighting a war." Another dismissed it as trucker folklore. The military mind resisted. Doctrine was doctrine, training was standardized. You couldn't just change how convoys moved based on one corporal's habits, except the numbers kept coming in. Every convoy that followed DeWitt's principles reported savings between 12 and 20%. Fewer breakdowns. Faster arrival times despite the same average speed. Drivers reported less fatigue. The evidence was mounting, undeniable, and persistent. Then came December 16, 1944, the Ardennes forest. The snow fell thick and silent that morning, covering the American positions in a white blanket. And then the German guns opened fire. 200,000 German troops, 600 tanks, and the last reserves of Hitler's armies came crashing through the thin Allied lines in a desperate offensive. The goal was to split the Allied forces, recapture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. But the Germans had one critical weakness. They were running on fumes. Their own fuel supplies were nearly exhausted. The entire offensive relied on capturing intact Allied fuel dumps. Without them, the panzers would become steel coffins. The initial shock was devastating. American units were overrun. Communications collapsed. Entire companies were cut off. And in the chaos, the town of Bastogne became the critical point. If Bastogne fell, the Germans could use its road network to push deeper into Allied territory. The 101st Airborne was rushed in to hold the town, but they needed supplies, food, ammunition, medical supplies, and most critically, fuel. The weather had grounded all air support. The only option was ground convoy. and the only convoys that had a chance of getting through were the ones trained in fuel conservation, not because it saved money, but because every gallon saved meant one more mile closer to Bastogne. On December 22nd, a convoy departed from a depot near Sedan. 84 trucks, blackout conditions, roads covered in ice, German patrols roaming the forests. The convoy commander was a captain who'd read Klein's reports and trained his drivers in the new methods. They moved in near silence, headlights off, engines throttled low to reduce noise, spacing tight to stay together in the dark. No sudden stops, no panic, just movement. When the lead truck hit a crater and nearly jackknifed, the driver eased the brakes, kept the engine steady, and waved the column forward. No shouting, no chaos, just discipline born from practice. They reached Bastogne 36 hours later. Only 3 trucks had failed to make it, mechanical issues unrelated to fuel. The rest rolled in with enough gasoline in reserve to make a return trip. The defenders cheered as fuel drums were offloaded. Tanks that had been sitting silent roared back to life. Tank destroyers moved back into position. The line held. Not because of heroic charges or desperate last stands, but because the wheels kept turning. Because someone had figured out how to make a gallon of gasoline stretch just a little bit further. By January 1945, the fuel conservation methods had been quietly integrated into convoy training across the European theater. No grand announcements, no medals for innovation, just updated instruction manuals and briefings that included phrases like steady throttle control and formation maintenance for fuel efficiency. Drivers who'd been in the service since 1943 noticed the change. Old-timers grumbled about new rules, but they couldn't argue with the results. Fuel shortages, while still present, became manageable. Convoys reached their destinations with reserve capacity. The tide of supplies kept flowing. The irony was that the solution had been there all along. It wasn't a new technology. It wasn't better engines or magical fuel additives. It was simply driving differently. Understanding that a truck convoy wasn't a race, it was a rhythm. That momentum was currency and waste was the enemy. That the way you moved mattered as much as what you moved. Corporal DeWitt never received a commendation. His name doesn't appear in the major histories. But his method saved an estimated 2 million gallons of fuel between October 1944 and May 1945. 2 million gallons that powered tanks, trucks, and jeeps. That kept the advance moving when it could have stalled. After the war, the principles quietly migrated into civilian trucking. By the 1950s, freight companies were teaching drivers to smooth roll their loads. Fuel economy became a competitive advantage. And during the oil crises of the 1970s, when every gallon suddenly mattered again, transportation engineers rediscovered documents from World War II logistics. Buried in the appendices were references to convoy efficiency doctrine and terrain adaptive throttle control. Ideas that had saved an army now saved an industry. There's something profound in that. The recognition that sometimes the solution isn't bigger or faster or more powerful. Sometimes it's just smarter, more thoughtful, more aware of the tiny losses that add up to catastrophic waste. Hartwell, sitting in that stalled convoy in November 1944, watching his fuel gauge hit empty, was seeing the war from a different angle. Not as a grand strategy of armies and offensives, but as a million small decisions made by tired drivers on muddy roads. And when those decisions changed, when those drivers learned to think about rhythm instead of speed, the whole equation shifted. The war ended in May 1945. Victory arrived in stages, celebrated in capitals and mourned in cemeteries. But in the quiet motor pools and convoy staging areas, something else had changed. A culture of efficiency had taken root. Drivers took pride in their fuel logs. Mechanics tuned engines not just for power but for economy. And somewhere in the vast machinery of military logistics, the lesson had been learned. That winning a war isn't always about overwhelming force. Sometimes it's about not wasting what you have. About moving smarter. About understanding that the distance between victory and defeat can be measured in gallons per mile. Today, modern military logistics includes fuel efficiency training as standard doctrine. GPS systems optimize routes. Engine management systems regulate throttle. Satellite tracking monitors every vehicle in real time. But the core principle remains unchanged. Momentum is currency. Waste is the enemy. And the way you move matters as much as where you're going. It's a lesson learned on frozen roads in Belgium, taught by a trucker from Missouri, and paid for in the lives that were saved because a tank had fuel when it needed it most. Because a convoy arrived when it was supposed to. Because someone figured out how to make a gallon stretch just a little bit further. When you drive past a military convoy today on an American highway, watch how they move. The spacing is precise. The speed is steady. They don't race. They don't weave. They just flow. That's DeWitt's legacy. Still alive. Still working. The Army Transportation Corps now teaches fuel economy as part of basic convoy operations. New drivers learn about drafting, about throttle discipline, about reading terrain before it arrives. They learn that a good driver isn't the fastest one. It's the one who arrives with fuel in the tank and no wear on the engine. These aren't romantic lessons. They don't make for exciting training films. But they work. In Iraq and Afghanistan, when fuel convoys became the most dangerous missions soldiers could run, every gallon saved meant one less convoy through hostile territory, one less exposure to IEDs, one less risk. The mathematics of efficiency became the mathematics of survival. Fuel bladders at forward operating bases were monitored down to the liter. Route planning software calculated not just the shortest path, but the most fuel-efficient one. And somewhere in those calculations, in those algorithms, was the ghost of November 1944. The same problem, the same solution, just newer tools. That's the thing about war. The heroic moments get remembered. The charges, the last stands, the medals and monuments, beaches stormed under fire, cities liberated, flags raised over conquered ground. But underneath all of that, keeping it all moving, are the invisible hands. The drivers who learned to read their engines like musicians read sheet music. The mechanics who tuned for efficiency, because they knew every wasted gallon was a betrayal. The logistics officers who saw patterns in fuel logs and had the courage to challenge doctrine, to say the quiet thing out loud, that we were doing it wrong, that there was a better way. They didn't storm beaches or hold impossible lines. They didn't earn Purple Hearts or Bronze Stars. They just kept the wheels turning, one smooth, steady mile at a time. Through rain and mud and darkness, through fear and exhaustion and doubt, they drove. And in doing so, in that simple, relentless act of movement, they helped win a war. Not with bullets, but with discipline. Not with firepower, but with patience. Not with speeches, but with the quiet understanding that sometimes the most powerful weapon is knowing exactly how not to waste what you have.